My name is Senna Keene, and the night my parents stood up in front of 500 people and called themselves my family, I looked straight at them from a stage in Phoenix and said, "Please sit down." I said it calmly, I said it clearly. And because the microphone was already on, every teacher, reporter, school board member, and state official in that banquet hall heard me. My mother's face went still, like someone had removed the light from behind her eyes. My father's jaw tightened the way it always did when money could not solve a problem. They had spent years being ashamed of me because I became a teacher. Not a lawyer, not a business executive, not a polished daughter they could display beside their name. A teacher. And not even the kind of teacher they could brag about at expensive dinners. I worked at Saguaro Bridge Community School, a small alternative public school outside Painted Mesa, Arizona, where kids came with court dates, foster files, missing parents, eviction notices, hunger, anger, and more pain than most adults knew how to carry. My parents called my work embarrassing. Then my name reached a stage they wanted to own. Before I tell you what happened after my mother tried to claim me in that room, tell me this. Have you ever had someone act ashamed of you in private, then proud of you in public? If you know that feeling, you already understand why I did what I did. I grew up in a family where appearances were treated like oxygen. My father, Orrin Keene, built luxury desert homes for people who wanted glass walls, heated pools, imported stone, and a view of red mountains they only admired through tinted windows. He was the kind of man who could walk into a restaurant and make the host nervous without raising his voice. My mother, Meredith Keene, ran charity luncheons, education fundraisers, and polished little committees where women in cream suits talked about giving back while never getting close enough to the people they were giving to. My older brother, Baird, went into commercial finance and learned to turn every conversation into a transaction. My sister, Talis, opened an interior design studio in Scottsdale and became famous among wealthy homeowners who wanted their living rooms to look effortless for a price that could have paid a teacher's salary for a year. Then there was me, the youngest Keene, the girl they believed would become a corporate attorney and one day protect the family business from lawsuits, bad press, and people like me. The problem was, I never wanted their kind of life. When I was 17, I volunteered one summer at a reading program in Painted Mesa. I met a boy named Jalen who wore the same gray hoodie every day, even in the heat, because it was the only thing he owned that felt like his. He was 12 and could barely read a paragraph without pretending to cough, so no one would hear him struggle. Every adult had labeled him difficult, lazy, angry, hopeless. But when I sat beside him with a book about desert animals and told him he didn't have to rush, something changed. By the end of the summer, he read 2 full pages out loud and then looked around the room like he had just discovered a secret door inside himself. That was the first time I understood what a classroom could be. Not a place where children proved their worth, but a place where someone finally told them they still had some. I told my parents I wanted to study education. My mother lowered her wine glass like I had said something vulgar. My father stared at me for a long time and said, "Teaching is respectable for people who have no better options." I remember answering, "Then maybe I want to be respectable in a different way." No one laughed. No one said they were proud. At first, their disappointment wore polite clothes. My mother told her friends I was exploring service work. My father said I was going through a soft phase. When I graduated with my teaching degree, they hosted a dinner at a restaurant in Sedona, but somehow the night became about Talis winning a design magazine mention. My mother passed Talis's printed article around the table while my teaching certificate stayed in its envelope beside my plate, untouched under the butter knife. Baird gave me a half smile and said, "At least summer breaks are nice." My father added, "You can always go to law school when reality settles in." I smiled because I was 22 and still believed patience could turn into love if I waited long enough. I did not understand yet that some families do not grow into acceptance. They only wait for you to become easier to explain. Saguaro Bridge Community School sat between a tire shop and a closed grocery store on the east edge of Painted Mesa. The paint peeled near the gym doors. The library had more donated paperbacks than new books. Half our students arrived late because they were taking younger siblings to school first. Some came from foster homes. Some lived with grandparents. Some were on probation for things that sounded worse on paper than they looked in a child's eyes. I taught English to 7th and 8th graders who had already learned how to make adults give up. My first month, a boy flipped a desk, a girl walked out during a reading test, and one student wrote, "School is a waiting room for failure," across the back of his notebook. I went home that day and cried in my car, not because I regretted teaching, but because I was terrified I would not be strong enough to do it well. The next morning, I came back with breakfast bars, fresh pencils, and a rule I wrote on the board in blue marker. If you are here, you still count. That rule became the beginning of everything. There was a desk near the back window, desk 19, that seemed to stay empty more than the others. A student would sit there for 2 weeks, then disappear because of a family move, a shelter placement, a court hearing, an unpaid phone bill, or a parent who stopped answering school calls. One afternoon, after I found out the girl who had been sitting there had moved into a motel 2 towns away, I taped a small card to the desk that said, "We noticed." My friend Yara Fenwick, who taught special education down the hall, saw it and asked what it meant. I told her, "It means no child disappears quietly from my room." Yara nodded and said, "Then let's make that bigger." We started calling families before absences turned into vanishings. We built a pantry from donated snacks. We collected bus passes. We started an after-school writing club because some students could not say what they felt, but they could write it if no one stood over them. We called it the Desk 19 Project because it began with one empty chair and the belief that an empty chair should break somebody's heart. My parents knew none of this because they had stopped asking real questions. They asked if I was still at that school. They asked when I planned to move somewhere safer. They asked if my students were violent, as if a child's pain was contagious. One December, my mother invited me to a Keene Family Foundation gala in Scottsdale. The foundation had started giving small grants to education groups, mostly because education looked good on brochures. I wore a simple navy dress and drove 2 hours after school with marker ink still on my fingers. My mother stood on stage under gold lighting and spoke about our family's lifelong commitment to children. She mentioned Baird's financial leadership. She mentioned Tallis donating design services for a children's reading lounge and a private academy. She did not mention that her youngest daughter was a public school teacher. Later, a donor smiled at me and said, "Meredith told us you're still finding your direction." I looked across the room at my mother, who was laughing with a state senator, and finally understood that she was not waiting for me to become successful. She was waiting for me to become someone else. The real break came 6 months later, and it did not arrive as a scream. It arrived as an email. A donor coordinator accidentally copied my school address on a foundation update. The subject line read, "Brand positioning before spring campaign." I almost deleted it, assuming it had nothing to do with me. Then I saw my name. Attached was a memo from the Keene Family Foundation. It said, "Senna Keene is no longer publicly associated with the Keene Family Foundation or the Keene Family brand. Her employment choices do not reflect our values." Below that, my mother had written, "A remedial school teacher cannot represent this family." Baird replied, "Good. Keep her name off all public materials." Tallis added, "Honestly, this protects all of us." I read those lines in the empty teacher's lounge while the vending machine hummed beside me and the Arizona sun burned white through the blinds. I expected to cry. Instead, something inside me became very quiet. Not empty, not dead, just quiet in the way a courtroom goes quiet before the verdict is read. I saved the email, then I printed it, then I folded the pages and put them in the back of my gradebook like a strange kind of birth certificate for the woman I was about to become. That night, my mother called 3 times. I did not answer. My father sent one text. "We should discuss this rationally." I did not answer that either. The next morning, I changed my emergency contact at school. The secretary looked surprised when I gave her Dr. Opaline Cross's name instead of my mother's. Dr. Cross had been my principal during my first year, a silver-haired woman with a voice like warm gravel and eyes that could see through excuses. She had defended me when parents complained that my standards were too soft because I believed hungry kids should eat before testing. She had once told me, Senna, tenderness is not weakness. It is discipline with a soul. For the first time in my life, my emergency contact was not the woman who gave birth to me. It was the woman who had actually answered when I called. The next 2 years did not look dramatic from the outside. I did not post sad quotes. I did not expose my parents online. I did not show up at their house with printed proof and trembling hands. I simply stopped attending events where I had to shrink to fit in. I spent my mornings teaching comma rules to students who thought grammar was a punishment. I spent my afternoons calling guardians, court liaisons, caseworkers, bus offices, and anyone else who could help keep a child in a seat long enough to learn. Yara and I turned the Desk 19 project into a real support system. Dr. Cross, who had moved into a state advisory position, helped us write our first grant. A local mechanic donated breakfast cards. A retired librarian started coming every Wednesday with boxes of books. Slowly, attendance climbed. Reading levels moved. Suspensions dropped. Students who used to leave without warning began writing notes when they needed help. They still struggled. They still had hard days, but fewer of them vanished. The student who changed me most was Dovi Reyes. She arrived in my room at 13 with chopped black hair, a cracked phone, and a stare so sharp it could cut rope. Her file said defiant, disruptive, academically behind. I learned later that files often say more about tired adults than wounded children. Dovi refused to read out loud. She slept through the first writing club meeting with her head on her backpack. The second week, she wrote one sentence on a page and shoved it across the table before leaving. It said, "Nobody looks for you unless you owe them something." I wrote back underneath, "I looked today, and you owed me nothing." The next week, she stayed for 10 minutes, then 20. By spring, she wrote an essay called "The First Person Who Noticed I Was Missing." It was about the day she skipped school because her mother had been arrested, and she expected no one to care. I had called 3 numbers, then driven with Yara to the motel office after school and left a note with a bag of granola bars. Dovi wrote, "Ms. Keene did not save my life like in a movie. She just made it harder for me to disappear." I kept a copy of that essay in my desk. I did not know it would one day change the course of my life. In February, Dr. Opaline Cross called me during lunch. I was eating microwaved soup and checking a stack of essays when her name lit up my phone. "Senna," she said. "Before you argue, listen." That was how I knew something serious had happened. She told me she had nominated the Desk 19 project for the Arizona Educators of Courage Award, a statewide honor given to one educator whose work changed access, retention, and student dignity. I almost laughed. "Opaline, I work in a building where the copy machine jams if someone breathes near it. This is not an award school," she said. "That is exactly why they need to see it." 3 weeks later, I got the official call. The committee had selected me. The banquet would be in Phoenix. 500 guests, press coverage, state education leaders, a keynote from the governor. I sat at my desk after the call ended, surrounded by half-graded papers and old posters, and felt more scared than happy. Not because I did not want the honor, but because I knew what attention did. It attracted people who had not been there for the work, but wanted to stand near the shine. The news went public on a Thursday morning. By noon, my school phone would not stop ringing. Teachers hugged me in the hallway. Yara cried into a paper towel and pretended she had allergies. Dovi walked into my room, dropped a vending machine cookie on my desk, and said, "Congratulations," or whatever, which from Dovi meant more than flowers. That evening, my mother emailed me for the first time in almost 2 years. Subject line, "Proud of you." I stared at it for a long time before opening it. "My dear Senna," it began, as if we were women who had misplaced each other at a market instead of mother and daughter, separated by a memo. "Your father and I saw the wonderful news. We always knew your compassion would lead somewhere meaningful. We would love to celebrate as a family. No apology. No mention of the foundation email. No recognition of the years when they treated my work like a stain. Just a polished invitation back into the picture, now that the frame was expensive. Baird called the next day from a number I did not recognize. His voice was smooth, professional, almost bored. "Senna, congratulations. This could be a great moment for everyone if handled correctly." I looked at the classroom wall where students had pinned lines from poems they liked. "Everyone?" I asked. "The family," he said. "The foundation, your school, the children. Obviously, optics matter." There it was. Not love. Optics. Tallis texted an hour later, "Mom is emotional. Please don't make this awkward." I replied with nothing. That night, I sat in my small kitchen while the desert cooled outside my window, and for 10 minutes, I almost convinced myself I was being hard. Maybe people change. Maybe success softens shame. Maybe my mother had finally seen me. Then Yara sent me a screenshot from a donor newsletter draft someone had leaked to her cousin who worked for the event vendor. The Keene Family Foundation was listed as a proposed presenting sponsor of the banquet. Under the sponsorship note were the words, "Honoring Senna Keene, whose values began at home." I called the banquet coordinator the next morning. Her name was Maris Bellwater, and she sounded tired before I even finished explaining. "I'm glad you called," she said. "Your parents contacted us yesterday. They offered a $150,000 sponsorship through their foundation." My mouth went dry. "For the banquet?" "Yes," she said carefully. "With several requests: foundation logo placement, a reserved front table, a family tribute slide, and your mother asked if she could give brief remarks about raising you." I closed my eyes. For a second, I was back in that teacher's lounge, reading the words, "Remedial school teacher cannot represent this family." Maris lowered her voice. "They said your work began through the values you learned at home." I laughed once, but there was no humor in it. "My work began when I survived the values I learned at home." Maris was silent. Then she said, "Tell me what you want." I drove to Dr. Cross's house that evening. She lived in a low adobe home with wind chimes made from old keys and a porch full of clay pots. I handed her the printed memo, the sponsor request, and my mother's email. She read everything without moving except for one finger tapping slowly against the page. When she finished, she took off her glasses and said, "They do not want reconciliation. They want authorship." That word landed hard. Authorship. They wanted to write themselves into a chapter they had tried to erase. I asked her if refusing the sponsorship would make me look bitter. She leaned back and studied me. "Senna, bitterness is when you poison yourself because someone else hurt you. Boundaries are when you stop serving tea to the person who brought the poison." Then she said the line I carried into that banquet hall. "You do not have to fight for the microphone. You only have to tell the truth when it reaches you." So I made my decision. I told Maris the banquet could not accept conditional sponsorship from the Keene Family Foundation. I told her there would be no family tribute slide, no parent remarks, no foundation logo behind my name. My reserved table would include Dr. Opaline Cross, Yara Fenwick, Dovie Reyes, Dovie's grandmother, and 2 former students who had graduated because of the Desk 19 project. My parents could attend if they bought general guest tickets like anyone else. I would not block them. I would not create a scene. I would not give them the villain story they could retell later. I would simply refuse to lie. The week before the banquet, my mother sent flowers to the school, white lilies in a glass vase with a card that said, "For our beautiful daughter, we are so proud." Dovie saw them on my desk and asked, "Are those from people who were mean before you got famous?" I looked at her, surprised by how easily children can name what adults decorate. "Something like that," I said. She shrugged. "Don't put them near Desk 19. That desk is for people who show up." The banquet was held in a Phoenix Civic Auditorium with high ceilings, blue carpet, and chandeliers that looked too delicate for a room full of teachers who knew how to survive fluorescent lights and broken staplers. I wore a dark green dress Yara helped me choose because she said navy made me look like I was about to lead a budget meeting. Dovie wore a silver headband and kept smoothing the front of her dress like she was trying to convince herself she belonged there. "You belong," I whispered. She rolled her eyes, but she smiled. When we entered the ballroom, I saw my parents almost immediately. Meredith wore ivory silk and pearls, her hair swept into a perfect twist. Oren stood beside her in a charcoal suit with a silver tie. Tallis was camera-ready in rust-colored satin, and Baird checked his phone like the room was a market he was evaluating. They were not seated at my table. They were 3 rows back, close enough to be seen, far enough to understand they had not won. The program began with speeches about public education, resilience, and community courage. I listened, but my body felt like it was made of wire. On the big screen, names and projects appeared one by one. Then the lights dimmed, and Maris walked to the podium. "Tonight's educator of courage is a teacher whose work began with one empty desk," she said. A photo appeared behind her. Not the Keene family logo, not my parents' foundation, not a polished portrait of me. It was a picture of Desk 19, scratched wood, blue tape on one corner, and a small card that said, "We noticed." I heard Dovie inhale beside me. Maris continued, "The Desk 19 project at Saguaro Bridge Community School has changed the way districts across Arizona think about attendance, dignity, and the children most likely to disappear from our systems." The applause started soft, then grew. I did not look back at my parents. I did not need to. Their silence had a temperature. Then Dr. Opaline Cross took the stage to introduce me. She did not mention my family name except as part of my full name. She did not say I came from generosity. She did not say I was raised to serve. She said I had chosen to stay in a place many people overlooked. She said I had built a program from bus passes, breakfast bars, late phone calls, and radical persistence. She read one line from Dovie's essay. "Miss Keene did not save my life like in a movie. She just made it harder for me to disappear." The room went completely still. Dovie stared at the tablecloth, blinking fast. Dr. Cross looked toward her and said, "That is education at its most human." Then she turned to me. "Please welcome Senna Keene." I walked to the stage with my heart beating so hard I could feel it in my wrists. 500 people looked at me. Cameras blinked red. Somewhere in the 3rd row, my mother lifted her chin, ready for the moment she thought belonged to her. I thanked the committee. I thanked the educators in the room. I thanked Saguaro Bridge, where every teacher had learned how to love students without making love soft or foolish. I thanked Yara, who had stood beside me during home visits, grant deadlines, and days when hope felt like a chair with one broken leg. I thanked Dr. Cross, who had taught me that tenderness could be leadership. Then I looked at table 12, where Dovie sat between her grandmother and Yara, trying not to cry. "And to my family," I said. Behind me, I heard movement. A chair leg scraped the floor. My mother was preparing to stand. I let the pause breathe. Then I said, "My family is sitting at table 12. The camera turned toward my table. Yara pressed a hand to her mouth. Dr. Cross lowered her eyes, but I could see the small smile at the corner of her lips. Dovie looked shocked, as if I had given her something too heavy and too beautiful to hold. The audience began clapping, but before the applause could rise, my mother stood. "Senna, sweetheart," she called, her voice bright and wounded at the same time. "Your real family is right here." The room shifted. Heads turned. Baird reached for her arm, but she pulled away. Oren stood too, slower, more controlled. My mother took one step into the aisle. "We are your parents," she said. "We raised you." I held the podium with both hands, not because I was afraid, but because I wanted to stay still. Stillness was power. Stillness kept the truth clean. "Mrs. Keene," I said into the microphone, and I watched her face change when I used her married name instead of mother. 2 years ago, your foundation sent donors a memo saying I was no longer publicly associated with the Keene family. or the Keene family brand. The room went quiet so fast I heard someone set down a water glass. The memo said my employment choices did not reflect your values. You wrote that a remedial school teacher could not represent this family. My mother's mouth opened, then closed. Oren's face darkened. I continued, "Tonight I am simply respecting that request." A murmur passed through the ballroom like wind through dry grass. I took one breath. I do not call people family because they share my last name. I call them family because they stayed when being connected to me offered them nothing. My father's voice cut through the silence. "Senna, this is not the time." I looked at him, really looked at him, and saw not the giant from my childhood, but a man terrified of losing control over the room. "That is the difference between us," I said. "You were always concerned with the time, the place, the audience, the brand. I was concerned with the children you were embarrassed to name." My mother's eyes shone, but whether from grief or humiliation, I could not tell. "You raised me," I said, softer now. "But you raised a daughter you wanted to display. I became a woman you could not control." A few people gasped. I did not feel cruel. I felt awake. "You were ashamed when I became a teacher. Please do not ask to be honored now that the room is clapping for one." Dovie stood first. She did it so suddenly her chair bumped the table behind her. Yara stood next, then Dr. Cross, then the teachers from my district, then strangers. The applause did not explode. It rose slowly, like rain finally reaching dry land. Soon the entire ballroom was standing, not for scandal, not for revenge, but for every child who had been called difficult, every teacher who had been called less, every person who had learned that blood can be loud and still not be loyal. I stood at the podium, eyes burning, and looked only at table 12. Dovie was crying openly now, angry about it, wiping her cheeks with the heel of her hand. I smiled at her. She pointed at desk 19 on the screen behind me and mouthed, "We noticed." And for the first time all night, my hands stopped shaking. After the ceremony, the governor shook my hand and told me my work should be studied statewide. Reporters asked about the project, about attendance, about Dovie's essay, about what districts could do differently. I answered every education question. I refused every family question. My parents found me near the lobby beside a tall window where the city lights spread across the glass. Oren spoke first. "Do you understand what you did to our name?" His voice was low, but his anger had teeth. I looked at the four of them. Oren, Meredith, Baird, Tallis. 4 people polished enough to reflect light and cold enough to freeze it. "No," I said. "I understand what your name tried to do to me." My mother stepped forward, her ivory silk no longer looking elegant, only fragile. "You made us look cruel." I shook my head. "I did not make you look anything. I repeated what you wrote." Baird adjusted his cuffs, slipping into the boardroom tone he used when humanity became inconvenient. "That memo was a branding decision. It was not personal." I almost smiled. "That is exactly why I cannot call you family, Baird. You branded me before you loved me." Tallis's face flushed. "You think those kids are your family now?" she asked, voice sharp. I thought of Dovie's essay, Yara's late-night calls, Dr. Cross's porch, the empty desk with the card that said, "We noticed." "No," I said. "I know they are, because when I was missing, they noticed." My mother whispered my name then, and for a second I heard the woman I had wanted her to be, the woman who might have hugged me when I was tired, the woman who might have asked about my students and meant it. But grief is not an invitation to return to a house that burned you. "Senna," she said, "we can fix this." I answered, "You can start by telling the truth without needing me beside you while you do it." The fallout did not ruin them. Life rarely punishes polished people that neatly. But it changed the way rooms receive them. Donors asked why an education foundation had disowned an educator. Meredith stepped down from the literacy luncheon committee to focus on personal matters. Oren's sponsorship offer became a private joke among people who had once admired him. Tallis posted a quote about betrayal, then deleted it when comments turned against her. Baird sent one email asking for a private resolution to protect all parties involved. I archived it without reply. At school, the Desk 19 project received funding from 3 districts, none of them connected to my father. Dr. Cross helped us train other schools. Yara said I was becoming hard to schedule lunch with because apparently saving public education took time. Dovey pretended she was unimpressed by all of it, but she began writing more, and one afternoon she asked if essays could turn into books. A month after the banquet, I walked into my classroom before sunrise. The building was quiet. The desert outside was still purple at the edges, and the old air conditioner clicked like it was thinking about giving up. Desk 19 was no longer empty. Dovey had taped a folded note to it. I opened it carefully. Inside, in her slanted handwriting, she had written, "Miss Keene, you said family is who stays. We stayed." I sat down in that student chair and cried for the first time in weeks, not because I was broken, because I was not. For years, I thought losing my family meant losing my place in the world. But I was wrong. Sometimes losing the people who are ashamed of you is the first time you can finally stand where you belong. So if you are listening to this and someone has made you feel small because your life does not decorate their image, hear me clearly. You do not have to become impressive to deserve love. You do not have to let people claim your success after they abandoned your struggle. You can understand their wounds without handing them the key to your peace. My parents were ashamed I became a teacher, but teaching gave me something their name never could. It gave me a room where every person mattered. It gave me a purpose no insult could erase. And when the people who rejected me finally stood up and tried to call themselves my family, I did not scream, I did not beg, I simply told the truth. Family is not who claps when the cameras turn on. Family is who notices when your chair is empty. Have you ever had to choose self-respect over reconciliation? Tell me in the comments. I'm Senna Keene, and I finally learned that the family you build with truth can be stronger than the family that only loved your reflection. Commentary, discussion, and deep explanation. Now that we have heard Senna Keene's full journey, let's step outside the plot for a moment and look at what this story is really saying. Because on the surface, this may look like a story about a daughter whose parents were ashamed she became a teacher. But underneath that, it is a much sharper commentary on status, emotional abandonment, social performance, and the dangerous way some families confuse reputation with love. Senna's parents did not simply dislike her career choice. They treated her vocation like a stain on their public identity. That is the real wound here. They were not asking, is our daughter happy? They were asking, how does our daughter make us look? And once a family starts measuring a person through optics instead of affection, love slowly turns into a contract. Senna came from a family that knew how to perform goodness. Her mother could host charity events. Her father could speak about community values. The family foundation could sponsor education causes, shake hands with donors, and print elegant words on glossy brochures. But the irony is brutal. They supported education as an image, but rejected an actual educator in their own home. That contradiction is one of the strongest pieces of the story. It exposes a very real kind of hypocrisy. People who admire service work from a distance, as long as it looks noble on a stage, but look down on the person who actually enters the difficult room and does the work. They loved the idea of helping children, but they were embarrassed by the daughter who helped the children. Nobody wanted to discuss at dinner. This is why Senna's profession matters so much. She was not teaching at a polished private academy where every parent writes donation checks, and every student arrives with a lunchbox, a laptop, and a future already protected. She chose Saguaro Bridge Community School, a place built around children who had been pushed to the margins. These were students with unstable homes, court dates, foster files, hunger, anger, and silence sitting on their shoulders. Her parents called that embarrassing, but Senna understood something deeper. A society reveals its moral character not by how it treats gifted children with easy support, but by how it treats children who are hard to love, hard to teach, and easy to discard. That is why her work was not lowly. It was morally demanding. It required patience, stamina, emotional intelligence, and a level of compassion her wealthy family never learned to practice. The Desk 19 project is not just a school program in the story. It is the emotional spine of the whole narrative. Desk 19 begins as an empty chair, but symbolically it represents every person who disappears while others pretend not to notice. In Senna's classroom, an empty desk is not treated as a statistic. It becomes a question. Where is this child? What happened? Who called? Who cared enough to follow up? That small phrase, "we noticed," carries enormous weight. It is the opposite of what Senna's family did to her. Her family removed her from their public identity and hoped she would disappear quietly. Senna, instead, built her life around making sure other people did not disappear quietly. That is powerful writing because her pain becomes her principle. She does not become bitter in the same direction. She becomes protective in the opposite direction. And this is where we need to understand Senna's strength correctly. She is not powerful because she is emotionless. She is powerful because she refuses to let emotion make her reckless. Many people think strength looks like shouting, revenge, humiliation, and immediate exposure. But Senna's strength is more disciplined than that. When she receives the donor memo, she does not make a scene. She does not beg her parents for basic decency. She does not rush to social media to prove she was wronged. She saves the evidence, steps back, and keeps building. That silence is not weakness. It is strategic dignity. There is a huge difference between being silenced and choosing silence until the truth has a place to stand. Senna chooses the second one. The donor memo is the most cruel object in the story because it turns emotional rejection into institutional language. Her parents do not simply say, "We disagree with Senna." They write that she is no longer publicly associated with the Keene family brand. Notice the word brand. That word tells us everything. They are not thinking like parents. They are thinking like public relations managers. They are not dealing with a daughter. They are dealing with a perceived liability. That is why Baird's later line, "It was a branding decision, not personal," becomes so disturbing. In a healthy family, the personal should come before the brand, but in the Keene family, the brand eats the personal. It consumes the daughter and leaves behind a clean brochure. This story also asks us to think about the difference between shame and accountability. Senna's parents feel shame only when their behavior becomes visible. They do not feel true remorse when they hurt her. They feel panic when others may judge them for hurting her. That is not the same thing. A person can be embarrassed by exposure without being transformed by conscience. When Senna becomes successful, her parents suddenly want to appear close to her again, but their return does not begin with humility. It begins with sponsorship conditions, front seats, logo placement, and a tribute speech. That is not reconciliation. That is reputational laundering. They want to clean their public image by standing next to the very daughter they once treated like contamination. This is an important lesson for the audience. Not every return is love. Sometimes people come back because your success has become useful. They ignored the labor, but they want access to the result. They rejected the process, but they want to be photographed at the finish line. Senna's parents did not ask, "How did you survive without us?" They asked, "How can we position ourselves beside you now?" That is why their return feels insulting rather than healing. Real reconciliation starts with truth. It says, "I harmed you, and I am willing to face that harm without controlling the outcome." Fake reconciliation says, "Let us move forward quickly before anyone notices what I did." Dr. Opaline Cross plays a very important role because she gives Senna a wiser form of power. She does not tell her to destroy her parents. She does not tell her to forgive them either. She gives her a cleaner path. Do not fight for the microphone, but tell the truth when it reaches you. That idea is mature. It means Senna does not need to chase revenge. She only needs to refuse participation in a lie. A lot of people spend years trying to force someone to admit the truth, But sometimes the most powerful thing is to stop protecting the lie when the lie walks into the room by itself. That is exactly what happens at the banquet. The banquet scene works because the parents walk into a space they cannot fully control. All their usual tools are present, but weakened. They have nice clothes, money, social confidence, and the belief that important rooms will naturally make space for them. But this room belongs to teachers, students, mentors, and the work itself. The screen does not show the Keene family logo. It shows Desk 19. That visual choice is a public correction. It quietly says, "This achievement did not come from wealth. It came from care." The parents wanted the stage to validate their family image. Instead, the stage validates the people they dismissed. When Senna says, "My family is sitting at table 12, she is not merely excluding her parents. She is redefining family in real time. She takes a word that her parents used as a possession and turns it into a moral category. Family is not automatic access. Family is not ownership. Family is not a last name, a donor table, or a polished claim made after success becomes visible. Family is presence. Family is witness. Family is the people who do not require you to become impressive before they stand beside you." In that one sentence, Senna moves the power away from biology and toward behavior. Her mother's interruption is also very revealing. Marith says, "Your real family is right here." This is not a private plea, it is a public performance. She tries to use the audience as pressure. She wants the room to see her as a wounded mother, and Senna as an ungrateful daughter. This is a common manipulation pattern in family conflict. The person who created the wound becomes dramatic when the wounded person sets a boundary. They do not want accountability. They want sympathy for being denied access. But Senna does not accept the performance. She stays calm and answers with documentation, not emotion. That is why the moment lands so strongly. Calling her Mrs. Keene is a subtle but devastating boundary. It tells the audience that the biological relationship still exists, but the emotional title has been revoked. Senna is not denying history. She is denying entitlement. Her mother may have given birth to her, but she no longer gets to perform motherhood on command after years of rejection. That distinction is painful but necessary. Titles like mother, father, brother, sister, and family are not supposed to be costumes people wear when cameras arrive. They are responsibilities. When someone abandons the responsibility but demands the title, a boundary becomes justified. One of the sharpest lines is when Senna says, "You raised a daughter you wanted to display. I became a woman you could not control." This line carries the entire female power arc of the story. Her parents wanted a daughter who could enhance the family image. They did not want a fully formed woman with independent values. They wanted compliance dressed as success. But Senna's teaching career gave her a different kind of authority. She learned to speak for children who had no voice. She learned to manage chaos without becoming chaotic. She learned to see value where others saw inconvenience. That kind of work made her internally strong. By the time her parents tried to control the narrative, she was no longer emotionally dependent on their approval. The story also challenges how society looks at teachers. There is a quiet disrespect many educators experience. People praise teachers in public, then underpay them, undervalue them, and treat their work as less prestigious than careers with bigger salaries. Senna's parents represent that mindset. They see teaching as soft, modest, unimpressive, and socially inferior. But the story reverses that idea. It shows teaching as leadership. It shows teaching as emotional labor, crisis response, advocacy, literacy work, community building, and sometimes the only consistent adult presence in a child's life. The story tells us that a teacher's influence may not always look expensive, but it can be immeasurable. Dovie's presence deepens this message. She is not there only to make the audience emotional. She represents the real human result of Senna's work. Dovie is the student who could have disappeared. She is the child who believed nobody looked for you unless you owed them something. Through Senna, she experiences a different truth. Someone can look for you because you matter. That line is almost the ethical center of the story. Senna's parents valued people when they were useful to the brand. Senna valued Dovey when Dovey had nothing to offer except need, resistance, and pain. That is the difference between transactional belonging and real care. The standing ovation is satisfying because it is not a cheap revenge moment. Nobody throws wine, nobody screams, nobody is dragged away in humiliation. The room simply recognizes the truth. That matters. The applause is not only for Senna as an individual, it is also for the dignity of overlooked work and overlooked people. In a way, the room stands for every Desk 19 in the world, every empty chair, every ignored child, every adult who is made to feel like a disappointment because they chose meaning over status. The applause becomes a moral witness. It says, "We see what your family refused to see." The lobby confrontation after the banquet is important because it shows that the parents still do not understand the core issue. Orrin asks, "Do you understand what you did to our name?" Even after public truth, he returns to the name. Not to the daughter, not to the harm, not to the abandonment. The name. This proves that Senna made the right decision. If a parent's first concern after hurting a child is reputation damage, then the child's boundary is not cruelty, it is self-preservation. Senna's reply, "I understand what your name tried to do to me," turns the accusation around. She is saying, "Your family name was not a shelter, it was a weapon." Baird's branding decision line is another cold revelation. It shows how some people use professional language to sanitize moral failure. They call cruelty strategy. They call abandonment positioning. They call rejection optics. They hide a lack of love behind clean vocabulary. Senna refuses that disguise. She names it plainly. "You branded me before you loved me." That sentence works because it cuts through all the corporate language and exposes the emotional truth underneath. A family that turns you into a branding problem has already broken something sacred. Talas's question about those kids also exposes class contempt. She cannot imagine students, teachers, and mentors becoming real family because she sees them as socially beneath the Keenes. But Senna understands family through presence, not prestige. Her answer, "When I was missing, they noticed," brings everything full circle. Senna's biological family erased her. Her chosen family recognized her. Her parents had money, but they did not have attention. Her students had little, but they had truth. That contrast is what makes the ending emotionally complete. The final note on Desk 19 gives the story a gentle landing after the intensity of the banquet. Dovey writes, "You said family is who stays. We stayed." That note is simple, but it carries more emotional wealth than anything the Keene family ever offered. It shows that Senna did not just teach a lesson, she lived one. She taught her students that they mattered, and in return, they reminded her that she mattered too. That is the beauty of real community. It does not move in one direction. Care returns. Not always from the people we expected, but often from the people who truly understood the cost of being unseen. So what do we learn from Senna's story? We learn that self-respect can be quieter than revenge and still more powerful. We learn that family titles do not erase family harm. We learn that people who reject your struggle should not be allowed to casually own your victory. We learn that success does not heal every relationship. Sometimes it only reveals who wanted access to the spotlight. We learn that boundaries are not evidence of hatred. They are evidence that a person finally stopped negotiating with disrespect. We also learn that choosing a meaningful life may disappoint people who wanted a marketable one. That does not mean your choice is wrong. It may mean you have chosen something deeper than their imagination can measure. Senna's parents saw teaching as lowly because it did not give them status. But Senna saw teaching as sacred because it gave children stability, language, and a reason to stay. There will always be people who call your purpose small because it does not impress their circle. But the size of your purpose is not determined by people who only understand applause after it becomes public. The story also asks us to examine our own behavior. Do we value people only when they become successful? Do we ignore someone's quiet effort until others start clapping? Do we respect professions only when they receive awards? Do we use family language as a way to control people rather than love them? This is why the commentary matters. The story is not only about bad parents and a strong daughter, it is also a mirror. It challenges the audience to think about how often society rewards visible achievement while ignoring invisible sacrifice. At the deepest level, this story is about narrative ownership. Senna's parents tried to write one version of her: the embarrassing daughter, the remedial school teacher, the public relations risk. Then, when she became honored, they tried to write a second version: the successful daughter shaped by family values. Both versions served them. Neither version belonged to her. At the banquet, Senna finally takes authorship back. She says, in effect, "You do not get to define my failure, and you do not get to define my success." That is liberation, not revenge. Liberation. And maybe that is why the ending feels peaceful instead of cruel. Senna does not need her parents destroyed. She does not need them ruined. She does not need to spend the rest of her life proving they were wrong. The proof is already living in her classroom, in Dovie's note, in Desk 19, in every student who stayed because someone noticed. Her victory is not that her parents looked bad. Her victory is that their approval no longer had custody of her identity. So if this story speaks to you, take this final thought with you. Do not let people who were ashamed of your path become the owners of your destination. Do not let a person who abandoned your becoming claim your arrival. And do not confuse a late public embrace with real love. Real love shows up before the applause. Real love knows your name when the chair is empty. Real love does not wait until your life becomes useful. Senna's parents were ashamed she became a teacher. But in the end, the profession they mocked gave her the language, courage, and moral clarity to stand in front of 500 people and tell the truth without trembling. That is the real power of the story. She did not just refuse to call them family. She finally understood that family had to mean more than blood, more than branding, more than a shared last name. Family had to mean presence. And once she understood that, she was free. The end.